On a top story this morning, it is that Education Cabinet Secretary Ambassador Amina Mohamed is set to launch a nationwide campaign on the 100% transition from primary to secondary education. Now, the campaign is aimed at ensuring that all the candidates who sat for the Kenya Certificate of Primary Education, that is KCPE examinations in 2018, join secondary schools. Amina is also on the record as having said that the intake of the KCPE class of 2018 was at 83% on the closure of the Form 1 selection exercise, adding that the government was on course for 100% Form 1 intake. Now, KTN News reporter Mary Moke is at the Aria Girls High School here in Nairobi, the venue for the launch, and now joins us live for more. Mary, good morning. What do you know so far when it comes to this 100% transition?
Good morning, Zeda. What we know from this end is that the CES is about to launch this nationwide campaign, and this campaign seeks to ensure that all students who sat for their KCPE exams last year transition to secondary schools. At the close of the reporting dates last month, we had a percentage of about 80% had transitioned to secondary schools. Now, this is a campaign that is going to encompass everyone in the society, from chiefs. I am told that chiefs will be put to task to ensure that every single child in their community, in the villages who sat for KCPE last year, go to schools. Those who cannot afford boarding schools will be going to day schools in the villages. Now, an issue that has been raised by principals and head teachers in secondary schools is that they are taking in students, yes, but they do not have enough teachers, they do not have enough books, they do not have enough resources, and the capitation from the ministry is taking too long to be disbursed. Yesterday we were with Amina at Jogo House when she was launching the university placement, and she assured us that the government has already set aside funds to ensure that schools have money to run their activities, and that no child, as long as they have been admitted to school, is going to lack school fees. So that is what we know so far.
All right, thank you so much, Mary Moki, for that. Now, I need also, Moki, let's also engage an education expert, Amos Kaburu, just to try and explain to us whether this 100% transition to secondary schools is achievable. And thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Kaburu. Is this achievable, and especially starting with the class of 2018?
Thank you. Good morning, our viewers. This is achievable, but however, it's no mean fit for the class of 2019. However, it's very, very much feasible, considering that this is the first time that we've seen such numbers being enrolled in Form 1. Actually, at no point in the history of this country have we seen more than 800,000 children getting admitted into Form 1. But there are serious and massive challenges around bringing in the additional 300,000 children who've not been able to report to school because of the factors and the circumstances and the conditions around this additional 30%. You might get that the resources required to bring in this 30% might be equal to the resources required to bring in the first 60%. Yes.
But as much as we're talking about the 100% transition, there has been concern in terms of facilities.
Yes.
Because when you look at the transition of the 2018 class, which of course they've transited to Form 1 in 2019, there has been a lot of concern in terms of facilities because some schools are overstretched. They don't have enough dining halls, classes, dormitories, so people are forced to live in a condition where it's not really good for the students.
Those are two different things. There's one thing in terms of getting access, and there is something else to look at what it will take for us to retain these children. And that's why we talk about access, that's why we talk about retention rates, because it will therefore require us to make modifications and make massive investments in our secondary schools for us to be able to retain these children for the next 4 years. But however, I think it's important for Kenyans to put this issue into context, because education reforms are taking place. And if you go by what has been proposed, you're talking about breaking the secondary school system into two, what you're calling junior secondary and what you're calling senior secondary. So we are likely to stay with this problem for a little bit longer than we are seeing right now, because if you look at the structure as proposed, is proposing reducing the number of years in senior secondary to 3, which means we're going to have a surplus of one class, yet we do not have the so-called junior secondary schools. So I think that we need to look at what are the transitional and provisional mechanisms that we can put in place before 2023, when we'll now be ready now for us to roll out.
Are we saying that the government was already prepared for this 100% transition? Because if the government was prepared, we would not be seeing this sort of challenges that secondary schools are facing right now.
It's very difficult to say that government was prepared or government was not prepared, because if you look at preparation, it's a very, very complex aspect, because according to government, they thought that one of the barriers towards accessing secondary school education is financial barriers, and that's why government has been very committed in terms of, one, increasing the capitation that goes to every child, and number two, ensuring that this capitation reaches every child. So from that angle, one can argue that government was prepared. But in terms of infrastructure, what it takes, and this is now where the time is the road. I think this is where we've got serious challenges, because you're requiring massive infrastructural developments. You're talking about massive numbers of teachers being added into the system. But as we are saying, it will be a little bit too premature at this point in time if we say that let now the system absorb more, because in another 4 years you're talking about reorganizing resources, and we have to break this one down for Kenyans to understand. 4 years from now, when now children are ready to go to junior secondary school, you're not going to remove the teachers who are in secondary school per se and take them to the junior secondary schools. You are not going to convert every single secondary school around to become a junior secondary school. So it means there is some loss of thinking that has to go about. And that is why all of us require some sense of sobriety when we are addressing this issue. So that we say that what can we do for the next 3 or 4 years? How can we accommodate these children without incurring so much cost that in the next 3 or 4 years we get that we have got resources that we don't know where to take them.
And it's good you mentioned about resources, because I was about to ask you that. There's been a lot of questions when it comes to funding. And this year we saw even secondary schools saying that they cannot even operate in a normal way because the government had not yet released funding, and the kind of funding they're given, they're saying it's not enough because some schools received more than the required number they're supposed to take in.
Okay, there are two things, and we need to put the right information for Kenyans to understand. One, government this time around is not giving resources to a number of children that have been enrolled in a school. Government is tracking resources that are given for every child.
Using the NEMI system.
Using the NEMI system.
And which, even using that NEMI system, Mr. Kaburu, that is when even we saw the PS for Education, Belio Kipsang, saying that so far we've released this amount for only these students whose whose information appearing on the NEMIs. Which begged the question, so what happened, or what happens to these schools they did not give information about the students, and yet the same secondary schools had teachers were saying, we are not even able to use this NEMI system?
That is not true. That is completely false. Because let's put this issue into perspective. As we speak now, schools have always been struggling to raise school fees, and that's why they have always been sending away children home to collect school fees, and some children will stay away for another 1 month, for another 2 months before this money is realized. So you cannot argue that because government has taken over the responsibility, schools cannot run. We have always had the challenge of working capital management in our schools, in the sense that some students have not paid fees. We know of students whose certificates have been held in schools because they have not paid fees, and yet they were provided with education. That is number one. Number two is the issue of schools not submitting their details for them to receive the capitation. I do not think that it is as big as some people are trying to make it. Because look at it practically. All our schools register students for examinations using a computerized system. Therefore, what is there for this magic that when it came to the issue of money, schools were unable to release these details? And I need to tell Kenyans one thing. Why it's important that we need to fix the NEMIS and be able to track money that goes to every child in this country. If last year when NEMIS was introduced and the system had more than 600,000 ghost students, let's break this down so that someone comes to understand why it's important that government enforces the issues of efficiency and accountability in the resources that are disbursed to our schools. If you've got an additional 10 children in one school, that means that government loses 200,000. If you've got 100,000, if you've got 100 children, that is 2.2 million that is being wasted. 100,000 children is a whooping 2.2 trillion, which is 2.2 billion, which is sufficient for us to construct 4,000 classrooms.
And talking about that, the CS is expected to launch that 100% transition today at Aria High School. And she said that at least, according to the candidates, the number of candidates who sat for KCP last year.
Yeah.
And when they're transiting to secondary school this year, it's 83%.
Yes.
How true is that? And what also do we expect from the CS today when she launches that campaign?
I think looking at what the CS is proposing to use the structure of provincial administration to bring more children to school, I think that's very, very simplistic, because the CS needs to understand that the factors keeping the 27% children out of reach to access from one places, they are more complex issues. You're talking about whether you are able to pay for them the 23,000 which government is giving as capitation. These are children from poor families. And therefore, the fact remains that some parents will still be unable to raise these resources that are required, because they need to pay for uniform, they need to pay for food, they need to pay for transport. These are costs which government is not taking care of. So unless the CS comes out and says that for this additional 10%, we're able to give these additional resources, it is not going to work. Number two, you've got the issue of the shortage of secondary schools, because unlike the primary schools, which are dotted in almost every village in this country, secondary schools are not the same. So you may have a situation whereby some children even have to walk for 15 kilometers for them to access the nearest public day secondary school. And therefore, it's very difficult for the CS to simplify this issue and just think that by waking up and telling chiefs to enroll children who have not gone to school and therefore hold them to account. I mean, what can I do if a school is 20 kilometers away?
And talking about that, in terms of access to school, and of course, this affects the 27% that are remaining.
Yes.
Because we've only had 83% transition.
Yeah.
Let's look at it in terms of the northeastern region.
Yes.
Cases where teachers have left that region because of insecurity. And so far, we know that there are about 35 secondary schools in the northeastern region.
Yes.
So how should the government address that issue when it comes to, 100% transition?
I mean, in northeastern, you're going too far. We are right here in Nairobi. If you look at the whole of this stretch from Imara Daima all the way to go to Syokimau, which is the nearest public secondary school around that our children can access, if you want them to go to a day secondary school, they are definitely not there. And these are some of the real issues that the CS must be looking at, as opposed just to simplifying this issue. If you started arresting the chiefs around here because the children have not gone to Form 1, what are you going to achieve? So I think that we need to have a more realistic approach. And that is why you have to look at what happened in the case of Nairobi about 20 years ago, when they realized that we did not have schools, because the schools that were in Nairobi happened to be national schools, happened to be schools, a few provincial schools like Pangani, which right now all of them have become national schools. And what happened? You had the provincial director of education who came together with the the former head teacher to Nairobi Primary, Mr. Joseph Karuga, and they came together and said that, can we have primary schools begin to accommodate secondary schools? And that is how you ended up to have most of these secondary schools that were established in primary schools. You have the likes of St. George's, you have the likes of Nembo, you have the likes of Milimani, which were offshores from the primary schools. So primary schools ceded part of their land, and therefore in the process, CDF came in and we started constructing schools, and that's how we were able to increase access. And this is the model that was adopted across the country. So the CS should be looking at such modalities as opposed to just beginning to criminalize why children are not in school. If you arrest parents because their children are not in school, what therefore happens to the other children who are in school? Do they lack their right to basic education?
In fact, when you bring that discussion about bringing in parents, and there's a lot of talks in terms of arresting parents whose kids were pregnant during the KCP examination
period.
Very
simplistic.
But that's another topic for another day.
Yes.
But when you talk about bringing in people, sitting down together on the round table and just having this discussion, there's been a lot of accusation by some stakeholders that the ministry has not fully involved them when it comes to this 100% transition.
Yes. That's very, very much true. And it goes to the point that our public policy most of the time is often flawed. Either we do two things. We either design policy for it to fail, or number two, we never design it for it to succeed. We never design it for sustainability. We never design it for scale. And that is the reason why even when you walk into our schools, the kind of infrastructure that is put up is weak. Within 1 year, it's falling off because we never design for sustainability. So it is important that the different stakeholders are put together. And if you look at the members of Parliament, for instance, they have played a significant role, because if it was not for CDF, we wouldn't be having all this number of secondary schools around. If you're not talking about the official development assistance, the role of development partners, USA, DFID, World Bank that they have played in this country, and you look at the level of resources that we are receiving, for instance, global partnership in education, is significant resources that government needs to sit down with these people for them to understand. Then you're talking about the actual implementers, teacher unions, head teachers association, parents association, sitting down with them to get their perspective. But the problem problem is when you sit in your house and then you make a policy and you want to ensure that it works everywhere. It doesn't work. So, and that is the reason why you're telling every school that we're going to give you 22,000 for every child. But some parents could be willing to pay for their children.
So why do you think there is that tendency of keeping stakeholders at bay, not involving them fully?
I don't understand why the ministry will take such a casual approach, and the end result becomes completely disastrous. And that's why if we are not careful, we are going just to have these 300,000 lives wasted as that. We are talking about, in addition to that, 35,000 of them, another 150,000 who got D-, whose lives are completely miserable. They don't know what the future holds for them. So I think it's important that we rethink public policy, especially when it is touching significant numbers of children, because you're talking about a system that is absorbing 15 million children. And for your information, in the next 13 years, the school system will be having 24 million children. We need an additional 350,000 classrooms. We need an additional 250,000 teachers. And this is not going to work if we still continue adopting this very, very simple and casual approach towards addressing public policy.
Okay, so now we're talking about 100% transition, primary to secondary.
Yes.
Then now they join secondary school.
Yes.
But there seems to be a bit of some silence when it reaches that part of the finished secondary school, now that transition to institutions of higher learning. Should the government also, have its focus when it comes to that? Because today is launching campaign about 100% transition to secondary.
Yeah.
So what happens? Should the focus also turn to 100% transition to institutions of higher learning?
Thank you. That is actually supposed to be the focus. But even before we focus there, the first question should be, what kind of experiences or learning experiences are we giving to our children while in secondary schools? For a fact, our secondary schools have become a dungeon of careers and hopes for most children. And that's why I gave you this example that last year alone, you have 35,000 children who scored grade E. That means that after 12 years of staying in school, after your parent has paid all these fees and government has been paying 20,000 every year for you, you come out with grade E. That is the cost of failure. I think it is not enough for us just to talk about, to wait up to 4 years, then we start asking, where are these children going to go? I think it's important that all of us ask government, what is happening in our secondary schools? Why are hopes dying in secondary school? Why have they become dungeons? We need to hold government to account for it to give our children some better education, that even if at the end of the 4 years in secondary school, even if they are not going to the university, because not everyone should be working towards going to the university, and we also don't need to take this very, very casual approach that we take, that they should now go to TVET. For your information, TVET is very expensive. TVET in itself cannot absorb all these numbers that they're talking about. You cannot have a country of 1 million carpenters. You can't have a country of 2 million tailors. It is not going to work. So I think that the functionality of our education is seriously in question, and therefore we need to have a serious conversation, even in this new curriculum, in terms of how do we design the experiences that we give to our children in secondary school, so that at the end of the 4 years in secondary school education, they have got a meaningful life. They are able to make decisions that will impact positive to them and even to the future generations, the kind of children that they also give birth to and begin to raise at that point in time.
So now the CS, once again, let's go back to this launching the 100% transition today. And what focus should we see the CS, what should be her focus today in terms of, okay, yes, we'll ensure there's a 100% transition. Are we likely to see the CS today talking about employment of more teachers? Because that's been a major issue. Are we likely to see the CS talking about infrastructure? Are we likely to see the CS also talking about, in terms of finances? Because there's some students who actually cannot even afford what you are saying, uniform, transport, and even paying for some of the nitty-gritties that are required by the schools. Are we likely to see the CS addressing all those issues today as she launches that campaign?
I don't think that the CS is going to address those issues, because we can even preempt what she's going to talk about. She's going to hold the chiefs and the assistant chiefs accountable for the children who are not in school. And that's why I call it very, very simplistic. I think what the CS should have done, should have had a conversation with the county governments, should have had a conversation with members of parliament who already have resources, so that we begin to ask ourselves that, yes, the chiefs have told you that I have 50 children in my location who have not reported to school. What is holding them away from getting into school. And they tell you that the reasons that are keeping them away are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then we begin to ask ourselves that 60% of our children are already attending day secondary schools. What spaces do we have in these day secondary schools that would accommodate these children? And the head teachers can give us this information. The boards of management can give us this information. Then we say, how can we address these additional numbers? What about when you go to places like Northeastern, whereby the distances are so long, you are not going to have these girls walking for 20 kilometers and such? What are the measures that we should be able to put in place? So I don't expect that if the CS is going to continue giving us these very, very simplistic approaches and answers to this kind of challenges, then as it is right now, government might decide to tell us that they have now reached 95%.
But why would you call them simplistic, Mr.
They are very simplistic because you cannot...
And yet the government is doing all it can.
No. This is what I mean. You cannot just begin criminalizing that children who are not in school is therefore going to solve the problem. That is very, very simplistic because we have so many laws in this country that criminalize almost everything. But it doesn't mean that people therefore don't offend the law. So it is not just because, as I told you, bringing in 80% of the children to school might be cheaper than it costs to bring in the additional 30%. Because what do the 30% mean? You're talking about children from extremely poor families. You're talking about children who have disabilities. And now the cost of educating a child with a disability is almost 3 times the cost of educating any other child. A child from a poor family, that means that even if you pay the 22,000, they are not able to buy uniform. They are not able to. This is what makes it extremely difficult. And you're talking about now these children who should be able to access day secondary school. What about if we no longer have spaces in the day secondary school? What about if you've exhausted every space that was available? It means that therefore you have to construct additional classrooms. That's why they're saying that bringing in the additional 17 or 20 or 27% might be more expensive than it costs to bring in the majority who are already in the system.
And as we bring this conversation to an end, because we need to come back for the second hour of KTN News Center, I'd just like to ask you, don't you think some stakeholders have also failed the government in implementing this 100% transition? And especially why I'm asking that is because there's some regions where even the CDF is not being used properly when it comes to accountability matters education.
I think that that is blaming the wrong people. It is a responsibility of government to bring together whoever it feels that will support the agenda and therefore take lead. And I'll give you an example of Kakamega County, for instance. Kakamega County is a very, very progressive county that has even put in infrastructure in secondary schools, despite infrastructure not being a responsibility of the county governments. So what the Minister of Education should have done, should already have gone to Delta House in Westlands, sat down with the Council of Governors and began to ask, how can you support us? You sit down with the members of parliament. It is not difficult to have these caucus. Sit down with them and ask them, how can you support us maybe to construct an additional 4,000 classrooms? This is where we are having shortages. If you don't do that, then the different CDF committees who have got complete autonomy will make provisions for whatever they feel like. They might choose that we need a road as opposed to we need education. So I think that is the Minister of Education which should take leadership rather than blame other stakeholders. When things are not working, you take responsibility, you don't go to blame your neighbor.
Okay, you take responsibility, you don't go blame your neighbor. Bringing us to the end of this conversation. Thank you so much.